Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving into what I believe, a surprisingly potent little book from 1925 by Bertrand Russell.
Right.
Imagine getting a snapshot of one of the 20th century's most incisive minds wrestling with the biggest questions there are. Our place in the universe, what a truly good life looks like,
hmm
and how the rules society lives by measure up.
Yeah.
Our mission in this deep dive is, well, to cut through the noise, pull out the core arguments, the genuinely surprising takes, and the insights from Russell that still resonate today, giving you a shortcut to understanding his take on these fundamental issues.
What strikes me immediately about this book is Russell's incredible directness.
Yeah.
He takes on these massive philosophical concepts, but plants them firmly in the scientific understanding of his time.
Yeah.
Even looking ahead, sort of predicting where science might go.
He really doesn't preamble, does he? He just jumps right into
Yeah.
what he sees as the absolute fundamental premise. Man is simply part of nature.
Right. He strips away any sense of human exceptionalism. He sees us governed by the exact same laws that govern everything else, from stars down to atoms.
No special place for us?
No special place. For Russell, there's no separate realm for humanity.
And this grounded scientific view leads him to a rather unexpected observation about, well, the state of physical science itself back in 1925. He felt it was actually approaching a stage of completion, almost becoming uninteresting was the word he used.
It's a wondrously specific analogy he uses, isn't it? He pictures climbing this incredibly high, challenging mountain, expecting some breathtaking view, only to find a restaurant.
A restaurant?
Yeah, a restaurant with ginger beer, surrounded by fog, but with wireless. Like the really hard, groundbreaking stuff felt like it was maybe done, leaving mostly the task of filling in the details.
That ginger beer detail really sticks with you, and he applies that same physical grounding to something as complex as human thought.
Oh, absolutely. He sees the mind as inextricably tied to the physical structure of the brain and, bodily energy.
He uses some pretty blunt examples.
Very blunt. Like the fact that iodine deficiency can turn a clever person into someone basically incapable of intelligent thought.
Right.
It's his way of showing how mental stuff is absolutely bound up with our material structure. An isolated electron can't think, just like one person can't play a football match alone.
And from this purely scientific, materialist view of nature and man, he draws some pretty stark conclusions about traditional religious doctrines.
Definitely. Especially concepts like God and personal immortality. He finds no scientific support for them.
Not at all.
Well, he's careful. He doesn't claim to prove there's no God or that Satan is fiction. For him, these ideas, whether it's the Christian God or, the Greek gods, they just lie outside what science can even address.
Outside probable knowledge.
Exactly. So from a scientific standpoint, there's just no basis to even consider them seriously.
Immortality feels slightly different, though. He seems to think science could potentially weigh in there.
It could, yeah, because persons are part of the physical world science studies.
Oh.
But he uses another simple, butted analogy. Think of a drop of water.
Okay.
It's not immortal, right? If you break it down into oxygen and hydrogen, its aqueousness, the property of being water, that doesn't survive.
Ah, I see.
He sees human consciousness, our mental life, similarly tied to the organized energy of the brain and body. At death, that organization is, well, demobilized, as he puts it.
So for him, the argument against personal survival is basically overwhelming probability from physiology.
Precisely. He felt the physiological evidence against survival was far stronger than any evidence for it from, say, psychical research at the time.
Though he left the door open for future discoveries.
He did acknowledge that, yeah. But even then, survival isn't necessarily immortality, just postponement.
And what about the classic idea, the soul and body being totally separate things?
Russell just dismisses that as metaphysical superstition. He views concepts like mind, matter, electrons, even the soul, not as these ultimate unchanging things, but more like logical fictions.
Logical fictions.
Or histories, ways we describe bundles of events. He asks, if a soul were truly indivisible from the start, how could it possibly grow and develop along with the body from conception?
Right. That doesn't quite track. He's also quite pointed about how desire can cloud our judgment on this, isn't he?
Oh, incredibly sharp.
Yeah.
He points out that the same metaphysical arguments used to prove the soul is immortal could just as easily prove the soul pervades all space.
Which nobody argues for.
Because we don't particularly desire to be fat. His point is the desire for long life makes us ignore the flaws in the argument. He sees the whole idea of immortality stemming from fear.
Fear of death, specifically.
Fear of death, exactly.
Yeah.
If we weren't afraid, he thinks, the idea wouldn't have such a powerful hold on us.
So fear is the root of it all for him, the basis of religious dogma.
Fundamentally, yes. Especially fear of nature. The uncontrollable forces outside us, those huge facts like astronomical reality and, yeah, above all, death. Fear of other people shapes society, sure, but fear of the universe. That's where religion comes from, in his view.
And religion becomes an attempt to sort of bridge that gap between what we want and what we can't control.
Exactly. If God controls the world, and maybe prayer helps, we feel some influence. Immortality takes away the sting of final loss. But Russell sees this as doing us a disservice.
How so?
Because it actually dignifies fear. It makes fear seem reasonable, almost noble. He argues that courage and rational reflection are the proper tools to face reality, not, comforting fairy tales.
And he puts it very personally, doesn't he?
Very powerfully. He says he believes he'll just decompose after death. Nothing of his individual self will survive. But he scorns the idea of feeling terror about that.
Because finite things still have value.
Immense value. Happiness, thought, love, as always, they don't lose their worth just because they end. The dignity, he argues, comes from facing our place in the universe with courage and truth, even if those open windows of science, as he calls them, feel a bit chilly at first.
That courage seems really central to his whole outlook.
Yeah.
Now, this leads him to a really crucial distinction he makes
Yeah.
between the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of value.
Ah, yes, this is absolutely key to understanding Russell's whole framework. He sees huge problems arising from confusing what is the realm of nature, fact, science, with what should be the realm of value, desire, ethics.
Meaning our preferences don't change facts.
Exactly. Your personal desires have zero bearing on whether a scientific fact is true or not.
So, in the philosophy of nature, humans are subordinate, and the world is neutral.
Right. The universe isn't inherently good or bad, and it certainly isn't concerned with our happiness. He thinks sciences like astronomy are great for correcting our sort of human-centric bias, showing that things like evolution are just earthly phenomena, not grand cosmic philosophies dictating meaning.
But then the philosophy of value completely flips that script.
It does, completely. In the realm of value, we are the ultimate arbiters. Nature is just raw material.
Right.
It's our desires that create value. He says in this realm, we are kings. Kings. And we actually demean ourselves. We debase our own power by bowing down to nature or some personified God to tell us what's good. We decide what the good life is, not some external force.
That is a genuinely empowering perspective. So, if we are these kings of value, what does Russell think this good life we should be defining actually is?
Well, that's the very next question he tackles. And he acknowledges right away, the huge variety in how different times and cultures have thought about the good life.
And he makes that critical distinction about disagreements.
Right. Disagreements about the means to an end, like, is prison or education better for reducing crime? Those can be argued with evidence. Science can help.
But disagreements about the ends themselves.
Like, whether war is always wrong, like Tolstoy thought, or if there's some value in being a soldier. Those, Russell says, you can't really prove one way or the other. You can't logically demonstrate that one fundamental desire is right and another is wrong.
So he just puts forward his own definition, hoping it makes sense to people.
Pretty much. He states it very clearly. The good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge.
Love and knowledge. Simple, but profound. And he stresses both are necessary, right? And can grow indefinitely.
Yes, absolutely necessary. And his examples are stark. Love without knowledge. Think of people in the Middle Ages praying desperately against the plague, but actually helping spread it through gatherings that leads to death and suffering.
And the flip side.
Knowledge without love. Think of all the scientific know-how poured into World War I that also results in death and suffering on a massive scale. You need both.
Which does he think is maybe more fundamental if push comes to shove?
He kind of leans towards love in a way. Because love is often what motivates intelligent people to seek knowledge in the first place, to use it to help others. But intelligence is crucial too.
Because good intentions aren't enough.
Not at all. Unintelligent people, even if they're really benevolent, might just believe harmful superstitions and end up causing misery anyway. His example is medicine. You need the physician's knowledge more than a friend's devotion at the bedside. But that physician also needs benevolence to make sure their skill helps everyone, not just the rich.
And he unpacks love, too. It's not just one thing.
No, he uses it broadly. It's an emotion, he stresses, not just a principle. He sees two main poles. One is pure delight in contemplation. That's where art comes from, appreciating landscapes, finding charm in people,
And the other pole?
is pure benevolence. Just the simple desire for someone else's welfare, even if you don't find them particularly delightful, like a parent caring for a sick child, or his example, someone sacrificing their life helping lepers.
And the ideal love combines both.
Ideally, yeah. An indissoluble combination of delight and well-wishing. He sees it in the best parent-child relationships and the best kind of sexual love, although he admits jealousy can really mess with the latter.
He also mentions wanting affection, escaping loneliness.
Right, feeling understood, which needs both sympathy and actually knowing what makes the other person tick, what makes them happy.
But he's realistic, too. You can't just make yourself feel delight about everything.
No way. He says, look, you just can't feel delight in fleas or bugs or people you find genuinely disgusting. Trying to force it would just numb your ability to feel delight at all. Even benevolence has limits. If you're competing for something, you're not going to be entirely benevolent to your rival.
And he insists we need that animal vitality, that instinct as a base.
Yes, very strongly. Civilization should be added on to that, not replace it. He's critical of ascetic saints or overly detached sages. They might be intellectual, but they aren't fully human in his view. Delight is selective, so conflicts between delight and benevolence are inevitable. You have to compromise. Instinct has its rights.
Okay, let's switch to knowledge, the second ingredient. He's very specific about what kind of knowledge he means.
Crucially, yes. He means scientific knowledge, knowledge of facts. He explicitly says he does not mean ethical knowledge in the traditional sense.
Because for him, there is no strict ethical knowledge. Is that right?
Correct. For Russell, judging conduct, whether it's right or wrong, is solely about its probable consequences in achieving desired ends. Science tells you how to get something done. Your actions come from your desire for that outcome, plus your knowledge of how to get there. There isn't some separate ethical calculation about whether the goal itself is objectively good.
So what does the word ought even mean then in his system?
He argues ought basically just means what someone else wants you to desire, usually someone in authority, parents, police, society. The power of ought comes from our desires wanting approval, fearing disapproval. Since all our actions spring from desire anyway, ethical ideas only matter if they actually influence our desires, usually through social pressure.
So the job of a legislative moralist, as he calls them, is just to manipulate desires, set up rewards and punishments.
That's pretty much how he frames it, to get people to want what the authority wants them to want. And if you think the authority's desires are bad, that just means they clash with your desires or your group's desires.
Wow.
His core point, which is really radical, is there is no moral standard outside of human desires, period.
That really pulls the rug out from under most traditional ethics.
It absolutely does. For Russell, the difference between ethics and science isn't about finding some special moral truth. Science gives us knowledge of means. Ethics is just about the desire for the ends. An effective ethical argument is really just a scientific one, proving that doing X will lead to outcome Y, which lots of people already desire.
And ethical education is different again.
That's about conditioning, he says. Strengthening some desires, weakening others. It's not about discovering moral facts.
So circling back to his definition, the good life is love guided by knowledge.
When he says that, the logical meaning is just that a community living that way will satisfy more desires for more people. It's practical. He's very clear. It's not about traditional virtue or sin, which he thinks lack any real scientific justification.
Which is the perfect lead-in to his pretty scathing critique of traditional moral rules.
Exactly. He sees the practical need for moral rules coming straight from the fact that our desires conflict. Me versus you, group versus group.
He talks about prudence first basic self-interest, right? Like Robinson Crusoe working hard.
Yeah, prudence helps avoid unnecessary conflict, increases your own long-term satisfaction without necessarily harming others. It's part of morals, but maybe the least interesting part philosophically, because it's just about you.
So beyond prudence, what are the main ways society enforces morality?
He sees two main methods. One is external pressure, consequences, punishments. Think criminal law, social disapproval. Attaching negative outcomes to actions that mess up other people's desires.
Okay. And the second?
The second, and more fundamental for Russell, is actually changing people's characters and desires to make them more harmonious in the first place. This is why love is inherently better than hate in his system.
How so?
Because love allows desires to succeed together. Hate means one person's success requires another's failure. So fostering love, benevolence, reduces conflict at the source.
And he argues that the moral codes we actually have aren't sacred. We have to judge them.
Absolutely. Judge them by wisdom and benevolence. He used those striking historical examples, the Aztecs eating people, which he puts down to scientific error,
Yeah.
plus a lack of love for the victims.
Right, or tribes dunking girls in water.
Exactly.
Mm.
And then he asks the really uncomfortable question, do our modern morals have similar flaws, practices based on error, or just sheer lack of benevolence?
And his answer is a definite yes. He sees our morality as this weird blend of utilitarian thinking and pure superstition.
With superstition often having the upper hand, he thinks, rooted in ancient ideas about acts that displease the gods, the whole concept of sin.
Like the taboo examples he gives.
Yeah, the kid in mother's milk are not working on Saturday. A scientific outlook, for Russell, has to question these rules. It asks, what's the actual harm of the act itself? Or maybe even more crucial, what's the harm caused by believing the act is sinful? And he really zeroes in on sex here.
His critique of sexual morality is incredibly strong, isn't it?
Exceptionally strong. He calls it needless cruelty based purely on superstition. And he goes through, stage by stage, the preventable suffering he sees caused by these traditional morals.
Starting right at conception.
Yes, the horrible stigma of illegitimacy. Inherited diseases that could be prevented, the grinding poverty from having too many children. He argues really forcefully that moralists who oppose contraception are inflicting a life of torture on these kids, worse than what the Aztecs did.
And he calls out specific groups.
He does. Bishops, politicians, he condemns them for supporting this cruelty in the name of morality, while, in his view, showing no real love or pity for the actual children suffering.
And he connects this to suffering later, too, in infancy.
Yeah, mostly economic suffering for working-class kids, lack of proper care, bad nutrition. He links the clergy and the Pope's support for social systems that allow this kind of injustice.
He also sees education being undermined by superstition.
Fundamentally, yes. He argues a lot of education isn't about teaching critical thinking. It's about instilling emotional beliefs, often nationalistic ones. He sees a sort of unholy alliance between capitalists, militarists, and church leaders who all rely on emotionalism, not reason.
Even the choice of teachers gets caught up in this.
Particularly women teachers back then. The restrictions on marriage, the expectation of lifelong virginity. He argued this was often psychologically damaging and discouraged talented, energetic women from the profession, again, linked to superstitious asceticism.
And clergymen acting as moral guardians in schools. He wasn't impressed.
Not at all. He thought they failed badly by condemning harmless things like consensual sex between unmarried people, while basically condoning real cruelty. He gives that awful example of a clergyman defending a husband whose brutality led to his wife dying from constant pregnancies, condemning pleasure, endorsing cruelty.
He's incredibly passionate about the need for proper sex education.
Its absence, he says, causes immense harm. He's very specific about what should be taught. Basic biology before puberty. Then, at puberty, a morality free from superstition.
What would that involve?
Things like mutual inclination being key. Respect for liberty, understanding that jealousy kills love, the seriousness of having children, knowing about birth control, and understanding the dangers and prevention of STDs. He genuinely believed this would massively increase human happiness.
And sex between consenting adults, without children involved.
Should be entirely private, in his view. No business of the state or the neighbors. Criminalizing certain forms of consensual sex, pure superstition, harming only those involved, if anyone.
What about marriage, divorce, and children in that picture?
He argues strongly against making divorce excessively difficult, especially when there's drunkenness, cruelty, or insanity involved. He thought those things were far more harmful to children than divorce itself. Making divorce easier in those cases would be better.
And the traditional focus on adultery.
He saw it as irrational, superstitious, compared to other, often far worse, harms within a relationship like constant cruelty or neglect, or that child-a-year pressure he mentioned.
It sounds like he believed moral rules shouldn't make basic happiness impossible.
Exactly. Like imposing strict monogamy when the numbers don't add up, that's just setting people up for misery.
He argues when rules cause widespread unhappiness and are constantly broken anyway, the rules need to change. Otherwise, you just breed hypocrisy.
He also briefly mentions nationalism.
Yeah. Calls it even more harmful than religious superstition. Fundamentally opposed to both love and enlightened self-interest.
And his view on how we treat criminals, it connects back to that idea of sin, doesn't it?
Deeply. He critiques the whole mindset of seeing criminals as inherently wicked people who deserve to suffer punishment.
So what's the alternative, the scientific approach?
Focus on preventing crime efficiently, and if you have to restrict someone's liberty, do it in a way that minimizes harm to them. He compares it to surgery. You regret having to do it, but it might be necessary for public safety. And moral indignation.
He absolutely condemns it, calls it cruelty, plain and simple. Suffering isn't justified just for revenge. If education and kindness can work, they're always better.
So how should we view the criminal?
Like someone with a dangerous illness, maybe plague. A public danger, yes, whose liberty needs curtailing until they're no longer a danger. But fundamentally, they should be an object of sympathy and treatment, not hatred and condemnation. That difference in attitude, he thinks, is why hospitals generally succeed and prisons generally fail. And this whole critique of traditional morals leads him to challenge very basic ideas like individual salvation.
Right. He sees that as a key flaw in traditional religion and morality, this intense focus on the individual soul, its relationship with God, getting saved individually.
Exactly. He points out that Christianity arose among people in the Roman Empire who felt powerless to change the world around them. So naturally, their focus turned inward, achieving personal perfection in a bad world. He contrasts that with Plato, whose republic was all about creating a good community.
And he thinks modern democracies should look more to Athens than Rome.
In terms of moral outlook, yes, because he feels Western democracies are still sort of stuck with this hangover from Christian individualism.
But Russell's own idea of the good life love guided by knowledge that needs society, right?
Absolutely. You can't fully achieve it alone.
Oh.
Think about knowledge requires massive societal effort, research funding for cancer, public education systems,
Right.
even basic economic well-being, especially in a complex place like Britain back then, depended heavily on the community, on trade. The idea of a truly independent individual for Russell is just a fantasy. A conscious or unconscious parasite, he calls them.
So the whole idea of individual salvation just doesn't work with his definition of the good life.
That's his argument. And he sees the traditional Christian focus on virtue, obedience, conscience as stemming from a mindset suited to living under despotism, not in a free society.
Because the good life needs more than just virtue.
It needs intelligence, health, opportunity, things beyond narrow moral obedience. And conscience, he argues, is a really unreliable guide, easily shaped by your upbringing, full of irrational taboos.
The things he lists for a full, good life education, friends, love, family, enough money, health, satisfying work.
All of them, every single one, depends fundamentally on the community, on politics, on economics. You simply cannot have a fully good life, in his view, without a good society.
And this is why he rejects the aristocratic ideal, too.
Yes, that's the fundamental flaw he sees. Sure, an aristocracy might produce some good things, art, science, maybe even friendship within the elite class, often built on exploiting others. But the core of his good life, universal love and sympathy, that's impossible.
Why impossible?
Because the aristocrat has to see those below them, slaves, workers, other races, as inferior. It's baked into the system. He uses that brutal example of English gentlemen flogging Africans. That necessary limitations of sympathy just condemns the whole ideal for Russell.
So salvation being individualistic and tied to these power structures.
It just can't be the model for the good life for everyone.
He also critiques another aspect, often tied to salvation, that idea of sudden, dramatic change.
Yeah, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, or Shelley's revolutionary dream, where overthrowing the king instantly makes everyone good and happy.
Right.
He notes how often revolutionary leaders have this belief, get rid of the external evil, the czar, the capitalists, whoever, and human nature will just miraculously transform, the millennium will arrive.
Which usually doesn't happen.
Leads to bitter disillusionment, often. He mentions the aftermath of World War I. People thought defeating Germany would solve everything, and it clearly didn't.
And he traces this hope for a quick fix back to Christian ideas of conversion.
Yeah, that doctrine of sudden, catastrophic conversion is the path to salvation. He concludes that while revolutions might sometimes be necessary to clear away obstacles, they're definitely not shortcuts to the millennium.
So no shortcuts then.
No shortcuts. Not for individuals, not for society. Building the good life requires gradual work, improving intelligence, self-control, sympathy, bit by bit, through education, through trying things out. Impatience is the enemy. It makes you grasp for those magical solutions.
And the specific methods for that gradual improvement.
That, he thinks, is largely a job for future science to figure out.
Which brings us neatly to his final section, really looking at science and its potential role in all this.
He starts by saying, look, the traditional moralist wants to improve behavior. That's a good goal, laudable even. But their methods are wrong.
How so?
Well, their main method, telling people to be good, exhortation, is mostly useless, he thinks. And the methods that are effective, like using economic pressure, often backfire badly. His example is how poverty and moral condemnation might drive men to prostitutes, which then spreads disease, making things worse.
So science is the better alternative.
That's his proposal. He sees harmful actions coming from two main places, either ignorance,
Which needs more knowledge, research, education.
right, or bad desires.
And bad desires are.
Socially speaking, desires that conflict with, that thwart, the desires of other people. He focuses particularly on active malevolence.
He calls that the worst human feature, doesn't he?
He really does. He thinks as if conventional morality actually cloaks it, gives it cover. He sees it as a major driver of war, cruelty, gossip, racial prejudice.
Where does he think it comes from?
Partly social conditions, he argues. Intense competition, fear of losing everything, trying to get security by dominating others, and partly physiological factors, he suspects. Cruelty flares up in moments of panic. Reactionaries, he says, deliberately play on fear, which just makes everything more dangerous.
So the job for his scientific moralist is mainly fighting fear.
Yes, that's central. And two main ways to do it. First, increase security, prevent war, get rid of poverty, improve health. But, and this is crucial, this has to be done for everyone.
Universally.
Universally. Recognizing the equal claims of all humans. Because trying to secure just one group by suppressing others actually increases fear in the dominant group too, making things worse long term.
Okay, that's increasing security. What's the second way?
Cultivating courage. Directly diminishing fear itself.
He notes military courage used to be an elite thing.
Yeah, aristocratic, often used for oppression. Russell argues that for courage to be a force for good, it needs to be democratized, spread through the whole population. He actually cites the suffragettes, common soldiers, Bolsheviks, even Japanese conscription as examples of courage becoming more widespread.
But courage isn't just fighting.
Oh, far from it. He includes the courage to face poverty, to face ridicule, to stand up to the herd mentality, which he notes soldiers often lack. And especially the courage for calm, rational thinking when things are dangerous, the courage to control panic. Education, he believes, can help teach this.
And he even speculates about physical factors again.
He does. He connects courage to good health, good physique, good nourishment, things often linked to wealth. And yeah, he throws out that idea that science might eventually find physiological ways to boost courage, the slightly weird cat and rabbit blood transfusion analogy.
He sees the spread of courage as key to real democracy.
That's the idea. When the qualities that make leaders courage, intelligence, self-control become common property, you won't need leaders and followers in the old way. Democracy will be truly realized.
What about other negative emotions, like envy or disappointment?
Yeah, he calls them proverbial sources of ill will. Frustrated desires, especially sexual frustration, often leading to judging others harshly. Envy of the rich fueling revolution. Jealousy, old people resenting the young.
And how can science or a scientific approach help there?
By making lives generally happier and fuller, he suggests. Encouraging cooperation over just competition, especially for young people. Fixing social institutions so fewer people end up with totally unfulfilled lives.
And for envy, that seems unavoidable, like between top achievers.
Structure the competition so it's about real merit, not just hurting rivals. Maybe even channel that envy into motivation for self-improvement.
Science also has huge potential for increasing positive things, not just reducing bad ones.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Better health, longer lives, huge improvements already seen by his time. He thought future discoveries in physiology and psychology would be even more powerful.
And this is where he gets into predicting science could actually produce desired human types.
Yeah, it's quite speculative, but he imagines science might learn to increase intelligence, artistic ability, even benevolence, by understanding the physical basis of character. He suggests there's almost no limit to the good world we could create if science is used wisely. He nods to his earlier fears in Icarus, but here he's focused on the upside.
He also pushes back against that common dread of the unnatural argument.
He does. Calls it a mix of truth and falsehood. Often just conservatism in disguise, natural, just meaning what you're used to.
Right.
He uses that great example. People might accept celibacy, which he sees as violence against human nature, but freak out about birth control, which is just violence against physical nature, like a steam engine is, just because one is traditional and the other is new.
He seems to distinguish between artificial things that block our desires and things that help them.
Exactly. Forcing people into lives that crush their basic impulses. That's cruel and dangerous. Living according to nature, meaning gratifying healthy desires. That's generally good.
Yeah.
So artificial things that help us gratify desires are good, like his example of an underground train for kids. Bad artificialities are things forced on us by authority or grim necessity, like horrible working conditions.
Too much routine is bad.
Yes, because it stifles impulse. Life needs room for spontaneity, adventure. We should respect human nature, not because it's sacred, but because our desires are the actual raw material of happiness. Science, he hopes, can help shape desires so they conflict less, leading to more satisfaction overall, making some desire sets better than others, like love being better than hate, because it's more conducive to shared happiness.
And he contrasts respecting physical nature versus making it serve us.
Powerfully. He argues it's foolish to just passively accept natural limits, like population control through war and disease. He contrasts the religious call for abstinence, which he sees as violence against human nature, causing misery, with using scientific means like birth control. That's just practical intervention in physical nature, like building a dam. He clearly prefers intervening in physical nature over doing violence to human nature.
So, in his future vision, nature itself is less absolute.
Exactly. Both physical nature and human nature become things science can understand and shape. Science can be the tool that enables the good life for future generations, giving them knowledge, self-control, more harmonious characters. He sees the phase where science is mainly used for killing as temporary. Real freedom comes when humans dominate their own passions, their own desires, as effectively as they've learned to dominate physical forces.
So we've really journeyed through Bertrand Russell's What I Believe here.
Yeah.
We've traced his argument from grounding humanity firmly in the natural world. Yeah.
Through his definition of the good life, that core idea of love guided by knowledge. Then his really sharp critique of traditional morality, seeing it rooted in superstition and fear.
Yeah, unsparing, really.
And finally, landing on this vision of how a scientifically guided, socially conscious approach could, potentially, pave the way for a better future.
He really challenges us, doesn't he? To ditch those individualistic salvation ideas.
Right.
To face reality with courage and reason, not myths. And to see that building a truly good life means changing society just as much as changing ourselves.
It's a remarkably coherent vision, especially looking back from now, considering it was 1925.
Yeah.
Very forward thinking.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, maybe a bit unsettling for you listening. Russell wrote this back then. Predicting science would eventually learn how to shape human characters, boost intelligence, benevolence, courage. Now fast forward to today. Think about the rapid advances in genetics, neuroscience, even AI designed specifically to influence our behavior. It lands us right on this massive question. If science does gain the power to mold our desires and ability, like Russell thought it might, well, who gets to decide what counts as a better human nature? And what does that possibility do to his own idea that real freedom comes from mastering our own passions? Lots to think about there.